If I were British, I have a technical term for this, I would be pissed. This is not a friendly action. It's not friendly. And, when I revert to being Australian, I'm pissed.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. Joining me once again today is Justin Wolfers. He's a professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. Justin, thank you so much for coming back on the Trump Report.
Mate, good morning. How does it feel to be talking across two countries with such close trade relations?
Well, absolutely. I mean, that will be the basis of our conversation. You've sort of teased it a little bit there. We're going to start with that new trade deal between the US and the UK, signed yesterday on the 80th anniversary of VE Day. It's the first deal, we'll get onto that, between the US and another partner since Liberation Day, and something that UK leaders have been trying to achieve for a number of years. Now, a lot of conversation on this side of the pond has been on whether it's a good deal for the UK. We'll also get to that. What does the deal have in it for the US is what I want to ask.
It has a PR win for the president and almost nothing of macroeconomic significance. In fact, Fergus, I think that you and I today are going to be responsible for more goodwill between two nations and closer trade than this deal will permit. So let me put it in context for your listeners. Despite this Aussie accent, when I say we, I'm going to be American because I'm coming to you from America. So let me put it in context. The United Kingdom is America's 11th largest trading partner. So as an Australian who is used to your colonial rule, it gives me great joy to have moved to a country where I can say, you guys don't really matter. And so for the US, the United Kingdom is about 3% of total goods traded. So from the US perspective, again, we're not thinking about this as the bilateral UK-US thing, which I think is dominating the British headlines. We're thinking about what does this mean for the stance of US trade policy. So the first thing to note is that's left 97% of US trade policy up in the air. Every country that's not Britain. Second thing to note is most countries around the world, particularly the industrialized countries, effectively gave up tariffs 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's been a period where tariffs lost the intellectual war and England reduced its tariffs because it understood it hurt the English. And America reduced its tariffs because it understood it hurt the Americans. And that's happened of all of the rich countries. It hasn't necessarily happened in the poor countries. What that means is that we arrived on the cusp of this trade war with most of America's great trading partners effectively charging us close to zero tariffs. Now, I use the word close to rather than zero. That's sort of important because basically everyone understands the logic of why eliminating tariffs is a good idea. We can reallocate tasks and each do what we're better at. But of course, every country is a democracy, and when there's democracies, there's interest groups and politically powerful interest groups. And so basically every industrialized country eliminated all the tariffs except they put a bunch of asterisks next to politically sensitive areas, right? So in Canada, that's the dairy industry. What is it for you up there, Fergus?
At the moment, in this deal, it's steel, cars, and a little bit of beef thrown in there as well.
Yeah. So these are folks who somehow get the ear of Downing Street in a way that no one else does. But what that means from the American perspective, or any of your trading partners, is the average tariff rate charged by the United Kingdom was 1% on average to its trading partners. That kind of says there's no point going to war with Britain because the best you could do is bully them from 1% down to 0%, which is really from low to low. So just there's no point getting in a trade war with Britain. So imagine we wrote the most expansive deal, which the president lied and said he'd done yesterday. It still wouldn't have mattered. It would have said that 3% of America's trade moved from a tariff rate of 1% to 0%. hopefully, Fergus, one of your next questions is going to be, is it that expansive? And I'm going to say no. And so maybe we reduce the average tariff rate that Britain charges Brits for goods that come from America from 1% to 0.8%. I made that number up, but it's kind of a guess that's probably approximately right. So when a 3% trading partner reduces the average tariff rate by 0.2%, you can imagine why, as a macroeconomist, I would sort of yawn. So there's just not much here. Now, there's so many directions we can go in. One is, what does this mean for the rest of so that's what it means for American trade policy. So far, not much. We'll get into what it means for Britain because you probably care about that. But I want to spend a moment on what it means for the rest of the world. Realize the president imposed 10% tariffs on every country plus reciprocal tariffs. And then he put a pause on the reciprocal tariffs. The reciprocal tariffs were the truly insane parts of everything of what he did before. But, where the US is a net exporter to the United States, like Australia, and so you just got the lowest tariff rate of 10%. No one knew or knows what's going to happen at the end of the 90-day pause. And I think many of us had some optimism that the business community would get in the president's ear and get him to back off. But actually, it looks like the 10% is stuck. That's huge because that actually, and so now let me tell you what I think the economic news here is. That says every industry in every country, the US tariff rate will be 10%. Of course, the British papers are full of, in one country, in a few small industries, it might be a little bit different. But that 10%, that's why I actually read yesterday as being the Americans becoming more protectionist, even as the newspapers were full of the news of the limited ways in which we became less so.
Because we should be clear, though, even on Britain, that 10% tariff stays on most goods.
And if I were British, I have a technical term for this, I would be pissed. This is not a friendly action. This is a big, I'm going to leave enough beats of silence that your listeners can figure out what it is. It's not friendly. And, when I revert to being Australian, I'm pissed. Let me speak as an Aussie. As an Aussie, we've done everything the United States has ever wanted us to do. We signed a free trade agreement with them. We have close to zero tariffs. We have zero on nearly everything. We are part of intelligence gathering. We have gone to every war they've wanted us in. We couldn't have been a better friend. It's extremely hard to believe the Aussies are going to get a different deal than the Brits. So we're going to be charged 10% tariffs based on the whim of one guy. There's a hard policy question, which is, how do you respond? Bringing it back to Britain now, do you respond the way Britain has, which is understand if Trump wants to punch the American people in the mouth, and along the way he punches the British people in the mouth, there's not much you can do about that, and you try and get the few small carve-outs you can? Or do you do what the European Union and the Chinese are doing, which is punch back? I think there's a very defensible case for a small country to understand there's not much that it can do and do what it can given the president's whims. That's my advice to the Aussies. And I think England has decided to act like a small country rather than a large country. And the truth is, economically, you're somewhere between the two. So I don't really have an argument with your Prime Minister on that.
Well, that's something that I wanted to ask you. So then, if you're Donald Trump right now, or you're in the Trump administration, surely, you're very happy, aren't you? You've imposed all these high tariffs with the, hope of changing America's trading relationships. And just over a month later, you've got a new trade deal with one of your closest allies, which, as you said, you don't think is a very good deal for that ally.
Okay, so that's the wrong framing. And I just want to ban, to all of your viewers and listeners, I want them to ban any conversation about who won and who lost out of this UK-US deal. Here's why. The pie is not fixed, right? When you got a fixed pie, if I win, you lose. So figuring out who wins and loses is super important. That's not what trade's about. It's a total intellectual mistake. And I want your listeners, anytime they hear a journalist who frames things that way, to get in the comment section and tell them to take Economics 101 and yell at them and call them economically incoherent and illiterate. It's a very human impulse, but it's a mistake. Let me go back and explain why. What is international trade? International trade is basically deciding how we reallocate tasks. So let me walk back from international trade and tell you how my family works. I have a partner, Betsy, and we share a household. We have a bunch of household tasks. And it turns out that she's better at some of them and I'm better at others. So what we do in our household is I do IT, I kind of like computers, and she does our taxes. She thinks taxes fascinating. She's a tax economist. As a result, I can promise you our taxes are a lot better and a lot more efficiently done. And honestly, Betsy's not very good at turning the Wi-Fi off and on. And so as a result, our Wi-Fi works more often. So what we've done there is we've taken our household's tasks and we've reallocated them to the person who can do them better. All right, let's add one more twist to this. Justin's from Australia. Betsy's from America. So what we're actually doing is international trade. And the fact that we're from different countries doesn't change the fact that reallocating tasks makes us both better off. And if there were a tariff, a tax that said every time Betsy did my taxes, I had to pay extra, I might choose not to. And if there were a tariff on me helping her with the Wi-Fi, she might choose not to pay it. And then we'd each be doing everything separately ourselves, including the stuff we're bad at, and my family would be worse off. So tariffs prevent people reallocating tasks in ways that make them both better off. And Betsy and Justin here is a metaphor, right? It turns out that British craftsmen are much better at making Rolls Royces, and Americans are much better at making SUVs. And so we reallocate those tasks. So you guys make all the Rolls Royces for America and for England, and we make all the SUVs for both countries. And tariffs get in the way of that. And so let me come back. You said, oh, so did the UK win or lose out of this? Whenever we prevent each other from trading, we're hurting both of us. So Trump imposing this 10% tariff is very bad for Britain. You're going to sell less stuff to America. It's very bad for Americans because I want the brilliant British craftsmanship that I can get. And now you're taxing that, and that hurts me. So to the extent that there are carve-outs, it's terrific. The steel carve-outs are a direct gimme to the UK. What else is in the deal? This business about Boeing, I have a strong guess. So they announced that America is going to buy $10 billion worth of Boeing equipment. Is that right? No, Britain is going to buy $10 billion worth of American-made Boeing equipment. This is the stuff that gets silly because America doesn't buy anything. America's a country. An American company might, right? You lose a lot of intellectual clarity when you talk about America and England rather than Americans in English. This is not political correctness. This is intellectual clarity. My strong guess, by the way, we've seen Trump play this over and over. There is some British airline that was already going to buy $10 billion worth of Boeing products, and possibly one of the negotiators was smart enough to say, Mr. President, why don't you take credit for this? And because figuring out millions, billions, and trillions is something people find hard, it feels very impressive, even if there's no there. Does that answer your question, Fergus?
It certainly does. And we'll go back to those tariffs there, because obviously you said that any tariffs damage the trading relationship, whether it's between Britain and the US. So let's think about some of the Betsy's maybe around the world. If you were another country looking at this deal, would you think that, so at least tariffs in some form are here to stay?
Yes. That's just a forecast, right? It's given that we sat down with the Brits and were willing to put some amount on the table, and there was a lot politically for the White House to gain because this was going to be the first deal and we all love the Brits and Trump appears to be something of an Anglophile. There was probably more on the table and more patience for getting there, and the 10% stayed. With it's a 10% across the board tariff with an asterisk. What that tells you is the only thing that they're going to negotiate is the asterisk. And so if I were advising the Australian Prime Minister right now, I would say there's 10% with an asterisk. I would also say the size of the asterisk is so small, it's not clear that you need to fly to Washington for this. I think it was, the steel, I don't think changes the world in any important way, but it does work for the Brits. So if I were your Prime Minister, I would think it was worth an afternoon of my work to get that carve out and the carve out for the cars. But I would not call it a trade agreement. And one thing I want to clarify here, Fergus, I think those of your audience in Britain have seen very different media than those of us in the United States. So the president declared this as a comprehensive and historic trade agreement, which is nonsense. That's why I'm here pouring cold water on that. My understanding, and Fergus, you actually read the British press, is it's been a lot more measured over there, which is to say we got a few little carve-outs. It was probably worth the afternoon doing it.
Well, this is actually something I wanted to come on to, because we should be clear. It's not actually, I don't think, technically even a full trade deal. It's a framework centered around certain goods. And in the small print, I'm just going to read this here. In the small print, it does say, both the United States and the United Kingdom recognise that this document does not constitute a legally binding agreement.
Of course it doesn't. And I don't remember if I did this on your show or not, but I did predict that the first trade deal would be one piece of paper and 7 bullet points. Turns out I was wrong. It's a page and a half, but that's because they added a couple of paragraphs describing how historic it was. Let me go back a step, because you actually got to something really important. A trade agreement passes through the US Congress. The Constitution gives the right to pass trade agreements to Congress. This White House has had no interest in Congress at all. And I doubt there's anything here that's going to go through Congress. I'd say it's 100 to 1. That matters because what this means is this agreement is actually just a handshake between one man in an office and another bloke. That means that when this man leaves the White House, the next guy can get rid of it with a stroke of a pen. Whereas if it had passed Congress, Congress would have to undo it. Now, I understand in Britain, usually your parliament does what the prime minister wants them to do. That is not how Congress works. So once you've got something through Congress in the US, it's kind of here to stay. And so there's nothing solidifying this. So what that in turn means is, would I be happy building a bigger Jaguar production facility based on this? No, because this deal's not here in 4 years' time. And of course, layer on top of that, you've got the American president who changes his mind every week. This may not be here next week. So then it's a deal on, so you're right, it's not a trade agreement. Arguably, it's a framework towards a deal, but that deal is not even a deal, or it's not a deal that businesses can rely on.
Okay, everything we've said there, I just want to go right back to the basics, maybe the last point on the deal. You mentioned at the start that, the UK only accounts for about 3% of all US trade. I guess what the Trump administration might say, though, is, well, this deal could increase that and make it go over 3%. They claim that, this is going to create a $5 billion market opportunity.
Well, if it's a $5 billion market opportunity, that would raise... that's a rise of about 12%. So that would move you from 3% to 3.3%. So I think you're still kind of going to be in the area of who cares. And that's taking the White House math seriously, which is a very dangerous thing to do. Look, there are two conversations we can have. The trade deal is best summarized as 10% tariffs with a small asterisk. And then the question is, what's more interesting, 10% or the asterisk? I don't know. Like, that's really a question for you and your listeners, right? The 10% means the US is cutting itself off from the rest of the world to a very large degree. So it could be also you get 3% of US trade, but we trade less. So that 10% necessarily drives a massive wedge between our two countries. And to be fair to your Prime Minister, it was our president who did it. So, no, if I were a British business relying on exports to the United States, I would wake up this morning feeling miserable. The asterisks help. Like, Fergus, my favorite thing in this is, you know which cars the US imports from Britain?
The Jaguars and the Bentleys and the Land Rovers, is that right?
Well, there's also Rolls Royces and Aston Martins. And I do want to say for the upper middle class, there are Minis, which we regard as awfully cute. But it's actually a very expensive car over here. So I want you to just imagine the meeting in the White House when they're sitting around and the pollster says to the president, we're having trouble selling tariffs. People are really worried about the distributional implications because these tariffs really hurt working and middle class Americans. To which the president replies, you know what will fix that? Let's have one carve out for one good that consumers buy. Why don't we make it the cars that Brits make? It's actually reading this agreement through an American lens and realizing that there's one carve out that helps American buyers. And it's the buyers of Aston Martins and Rolls Royces and Bentleys and Jaguars is insane. I mean, politically insane. Like, is it that these people didn't realize that's what Britain makes? Or is it that they did because they see them in the parking lot at Mar-a-Lago and thought, well, that's what people drive, that will help working and middle-class Americans? It's crazy. And what's amazing is the president actually said, well, we've got to give them a break on the Rolls Royces because they're a beautifully made, handcrafted car. The whole point of the tariffs is to bring production to America. I get British craftsmanship, but if the president doesn't think we're capable of learning how to stretch leather over a car seat, we have tariffs on bananas. No American worker is ever going to learn how to grow bananas. We have tariffs on vanilla. We can't grow vanilla. We have tariffs on diamonds. We can't mine diamonds. But we did decide that the one thing we definitely can't do is Rolls Royces, so we should have a special carve-out.
Well, we are incredibly proud of our car building in this country, and I'm sure we could talk about this all day, but I'm afraid we are running out of time. There's going to be one last question I ask you, because I know this was actually before the announcement yesterday, but something the president was talking about earlier in the week, and it wasn't in the announcement yesterday. There weren't any tariffs imposed on British movies. I know you've got some strong opinions about this.
Well, British movies being nearly as good as Australian movies, I have very strong opinions. Look, the movie industry's terrified. Or, ready, wait for this dad joke, terrified. What I understood is the whole thing was strategic silence, that the Prime Minister, we all kind of hope that the president just sort of woke up one day and just came up with this idea, tweeted it, and we'll forget it. And I think the British Prime Minister, in keeping with that, more or less decided not to talk about it. And the Americans, some of their staff likely hoping not to raise the issue, agreed not to talk about it. So I don't think we have any clarity. What we do have is enough clarity that the Americans didn't reach across the table and say, this is the deal, and by the way, we're coming after your movies too. So at least it's on the back burner. So I infer from this, so I think it's a very destructive, very silly policy. I infer from this that everyone's still hoping that the issue gets forgotten about. We don't have greater clarity, but I think the chances of tariffs on movies fell literally because it looks like it's on no one's front burner. Is that your reading?
I think that's my reading. But as we've already spoken about, things can change incredibly quickly during the Trump presidency, and that is exactly why we do the Trump report. Justin, that is all we've got time for today, but thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Thanks, Fergus.